The philosopher Dr. Bernardo Kastrup has grown an online following attacking the idea that reality consists of matter and replacing it with a brand of idealism that he calls analytic idealism. When viewers discover that I am an idealist, I regularly get asked to interview him on my channel. Well, I did invite him and he politely declined. So instead I thought I'd research his views and discuss my thoughts. The result is this video critique which focuses on my two main concerns. And they are big ones. The first is his method of argument. The second is what he says about universal consciousness. But before I dive into those, a quick disclaimer. As a fellow idealist, I'm actually very grateful to Kastrup for promoting idealism, and I find his views very interesting. And this has made me a little hesitant to make this video. But I trust Kastrup to see these criticisms as the bruises of a friend and not the attacks of an enemy. And if he wants to discuss any of the issues I raise here, he is always welcome on my channel. So, with the bromance done, let's get down to business. Kastrup's way of arguing is to first undermine our intuitive belief that what we perceive is what there is. For example, when I look at this apple, I believe that it's a physical object in reality, and that it is as it seems to be. That it's in my hand, it's roughly spherical, and that it's red and green, and so forth. But Kastrup presents two arguments that are meant to show that this can't be how things are, that the world can't be as we perceive it to be. But both of his arguments have problems that I think are connected to deeper issues with his method. To see that, let's take a look at his first argument.
The first line of argument is based on the idea of entropy, the degree of disorder in the world, which we know from the second law of thermodynamics tends to increase. Now, our own bodies are a sort of a local effort to go against the second law of thermodynamics, because our bodies need to preserve their structural and dynamical integrity. We don't want our liver and our lungs to mix with each other like coffee and milk spontaneously mix. If our perception were a transparent window into the world, then our internal representations, our internal perceptual states, would mirror the states of the world out there, the states of the world as it is in itself. But if that were true, we would be incapable of maintaining our structural integrity. Now, a way to visualize this is, suppose this is the world outside, and it has a number of states which I'm representing here with numbers. So state 1, state 2, state 3, all the way to state 6. If we were to mirror these states inside our brains, as you see here on the left-hand side, the entire dispersion of the states of the outside world would be mirrored in the dispersion of our brain states. And if that were true, we wouldn't be able to maintain our structural integrity. Again, we would dissolve into an entropic soup.
In a nutshell, Kastrup says that we intuitively think that our perceptions mirror the world. But the world is entropic, which means it's tending to a state of chaos. So if our brain states mirrored the way the world is, then they would be entropic too. And we would dissolve into what he colourfully describes as an entropic soup. Okay, so there are some pretty basic errors with this argument. First, we don't intuitively think that our perceptions perfectly mirror the world. We think we perceive things in the world directly, without anything getting in the way. When I look at this apple, I don't think I'm looking at some mirror image of the apple on a screen of perception. I think I'm perceiving the apple itself, as it is, out there. The view of perception I've just described is typically called naive realism or direct realism. It's called naive realism because most philosophers agree that it's the naive view of perception. In other words, it's the view of perception we have before we stop and start to really think about it. But the other label for this view, direct realism, is actually more descriptive and so more helpful for understanding the view. It's called direct because we believe we perceive objects directly without anything like a screen of perception getting in the way. And it's called realism because we think we perceive objects that are real and independent of our mind. If I'm right about what the intuitive view is, then the argument that Kastrup needs to undermine is not the view he attacks. And the arguments he raises simply wouldn't work against direct realism. Now, as it happens, direct realism is generally considered wrong anyway, but not for the reasons Kastrup presents. Among other things, it's rejected because if we perceive the world directly as it is, then it doesn't seem possible to perceive it incorrectly. For example, if it's the real apple that I'm perceiving directly as it is, then it must be exactly as I perceive it to be. But then that makes it very hard to explain things like illusions or hallucinations, or why some people see things differently to others. So as direct realism probably isn't a good option anyway, maybe it doesn't matter so much that Kastrup doesn't argue against it. So let's say we move on from direct realism and adopt the position that Kastrup actually attacks. That when we perceive the world, we perceive a mirror image of that world on our screen of perception. This is a view that I would call perfect indirect realism. It's perfect because the image that we see is meant to be a perfect match for the thing it represents. It's indirect because we don't perceive the world directly, we only perceive it indirectly via the image on the screen. And it's called realism because we still believe that the things that are appearing on the image are also real objects out there. So let's go with that and say that Kastrup presents perfect indirect realism as the intuitive view and the one he wants to undermine to convince us of something different. Now, I don't know of any philosophers that have adopted a position like perfect indirect realism. It is true that most philosophers think we perceive the world indirectly via something like a screen of perception. But they say this because they think what we see on the screen doesn't match the way the world really is. In fact, they use the screen to explain things like hallucinations and illusions, and also to explain how the world appears the way that it does when science tells us that the real world is very different. I've actually done an entire video on this topic, so if you're interested, you can see the link in the description or above me. But back to Kastrup. Since he's attacking perfect indirect realism, it seems he's attacking a view that no one actually believes. But if we put this concern aside, we're still left with the question of whether or not these arguments work against that view. And when we stop to think about that, we realise that actually they don't. Here's where the argument goes wrong. Kastrup starts off by talking about perceptions on our screen perfectly mirroring the world, but then he switches and talks about brain states perfectly mirroring the world instead, without explaining the change of subject.
If our perception were a transparent window into the world, then our internal representations, our internal perceptual states, would mirror the states of the world out there. If we were to mirror the states inside our brains, as you see here on the left-hand side, the entire dispersion of the states of the outside world would be mirrored in the dispersion of our brain states.
But nobody would ever think this is how things work. When I look at this apple, I don't think there's some brain state that perfectly mirrors the apple. After all, a brain state is just some pattern of neural firings, and neural firing patterns can't perfectly match an apple. The only thing they could perfectly match is another pattern of neural firings. So I would never think that this apple and all its properties were replicated in some brain state when I looked at it. After all, for that to happen, some apple would literally have to appear inside my brain when I looked at it. Not my mind, my brain. So switching from talking about mirror perceptions to talking about mirrored brain states in the middle of an argument is completely illegitimate. And the argument doesn't work unless Kastrup makes the jump from perceptions to brain states. I mean, if I were an indirect realist, I might think that if the apple was entropic, then the perceptions of the apple would be entropic too. But that would be entropy on the screen of perception. It would be a part of the content of my perception that were entropic, not my brain or my body. After all, if I think about an exploding bomb, that doesn't mean that my brain detonates. Now I realise that Kastrup is summarising somebody else's argument that he's read in the scientific literature here. But as far as I can tell, either he's done a really terrible job at explaining that argument, or the original argument is just really bad. And don't be intimidated by Kastrup saying that these things have been mathematically proved. I'm talking about a conceptual error here, and conceptual errors can't be fixed by numbers and formulae. The second argument Kastrup gives against the intuitive view is based on evolution, and looking at this brings us closer to what I think is the root problem with his method. So let's take a look.
Now, there is a completely different but converging line of argument that is not based on thermodynamics. Would evolution by natural selection favor our ability to see the truth of the world? In other words, to perceive the world as it is in itself? The answer is no. Evolution would favor us not to see the world as it truly is, but to see it through an interface, a user interface that would allow us to act more quickly, act on relevant data, to give us an at-a-glance overview of what really matters, instead of seeing the truth of the matter, which may be too detailed, too complicated, and basically lead us to ineffective attempts to survive and would drive us to extinction.
The idea of this argument is actually pretty simple. If we perceived everything in the world in its full complexity, we would become overloaded and we wouldn't be able to process it efficiently enough to survive. Instead, our perception provides us with a simplified view. It's not true, it's just useful. And for survival, useful beats true. Now, I actually think this is a reasonable argument to make. I just don't think Kastrup can make it, because the argument relies on principles that he rejects. Take a listen to what he says straight after presenting this argument.
The world as we see, the physical world, what appears on the screen of perception, the objects we touch, the flavors we smell, the sounds we hear, the forms and colors we see, these are the dashboard. These are dials on our instrument panel. The world as it is in itself looks nothing. It's a totally different paradigm. We don't know how it looks like, but whatever it is, it looks nothing like what we perceive. We do not have a transparent windshield into the world. In other words, we are pilots sitting on the cockpit, but unlike what you see here, where the pilots have transparent windshields into the world, we do not have these transparent windshields into the world at all. All we have is the instrument panel. Whatever is outside, it is by definition not the physical world, because the physical world is the dashboard. It's not what is outside. Even ideas, concepts like space and time, space-time represents the paradigm of perception. Perception can be described in terms of a scaffolding of space-time, but perception is the dashboard. This is space-time. It's the stuff in the dials, is how we make sense of the stuff that is presented to us on the dashboard. Space-time is not outside. So if that's what the physical world is, the dynamics of the dials on the dashboard, then what physics studies is the behavior of the dials, how the needles move with respect to one another. Maybe this needle is moving this way, and every time it moves this way, that needle moves the other way. And then we can write some mathematical equations relating the behavior of this needle here underneath to the behavior of that needle here on the top. This is physics. Physics studies, models, and predicts the behavior of the dials on the dashboard, which is what we call the physical world as displayed on the screen of perception. Therefore, physics is a science of perception, or to say the same thing in different words, it's a science of the dashboard.
So Kastrup believes that the world of our senses, the world of our perceptual experience, is the physical world. It's our simplified view that's presented on the dashboard. Further, he thinks things like space and time are just features of the dashboard. They're not how things really are in the world itself. He also thinks that our theories of bare science are theories that relate dials on the dashboard to each other. Again, they don't tell you how things are in the world itself. But this new understanding of the world then undermines his evolutionary argument for it in the first place. Evolutionary theory is based on empirical science, so it can only ever tell us things about the dashboard. Evolutionary theory itself is a theory about how dials on the dashboard relate to each other. And if time is purely a feature of the dashboard, then any notions that rely on the idea of time, like survival, procreation, genetic mutation, and a whole host of other evolutionary notions, these too only apply to the dashboard. So here's the main problem. How could a theory of the dashboard ever tell us that the real world was more complex and that the dashboard is just a simplified representation of it? What we need to show that is evidence that the real world is more complex than the dashboard. But according to Kastrup, evolution only ever tells us things about the dashboard itself, and that could never be enough to make Kastrup's point. So here's my diagnosis of the root problem with Kastrup's method. He seems to adopt scientific realism when he's arguing against the intuitive view and some of the views of others. But then he switches to scientific anti-realism when collapsing the difference between the world of perception and the physical world. Now, I realise that this is quite a dense claim, so hang in with me while I explain it a bit more, because I think it's really important to understanding what the real problem is. Scientific realism is the view that the theories of science are true, and that the objects that the scientific theories talk about really exist. If you believe there really is dark matter, and there really are invisible subatomic particles floating around through space, then you are taking a scientifically realist view towards the theories of science. It's scientific realists that say that scientific theories tell you what the real world is like and the objects that make it up. And you'd need to adopt the realist attitude if you wanted to use things like entropy or evolutionary theory to prove that our perceptions are a simplification like Kastrup's dashboard. But as soon as Kastrup has used the arguments in scientific literature to show that the dashboard is a simplification, he then suddenly switches to an anti-realist view of science. Anti-realists think that scientific theories don't tell you about how the world really is. Instead, they say that the theories are just useful tools for predicting what happens when we experience it. And it's the anti-realist view that Kastrup needs to say that the theories of science just tell you about how dials on the dashboard relate to each other. And it's only by doing this that he's able to claim that the dashboard is itself the physical world. Kastrup wants to say that these scientific realists are wrong, and that the real world doesn't consist of things like particles and matter whizzing around. Instead, he wants to argue that it's constituted by mind. So this brings me finally to my big concern with Kastrup's method of argument. He regularly argues for analytic idealism by drawing on arguments he's found in the scientific literature. But he rejects the scientific paradigm that they rely on. This seems to me like a case of Kastrup wanting to both have his cake and eat it. And I don't think that this method can ultimately work. Let's now look at Kastrup's analytic idealism. Using the terminology I've introduced, it's a kind of indirect idealism. There's the world of our perception, the dashboard, and then there's the real world outside or beyond it. The real world, Kastrup says, is nothing like the dashboard we can see, but certain aspects and features of it are represented on the dashboard enough to allow us to survive. The real world beyond the dashboard, Kastrup says, consists of universal consciousness, which is a field of pure mentation or mind. There is no matter, Kastrup thinks. There is only mind and the way mind appears. Kastrup justifies believing that the real world consists of universal consciousness in two main ways. The first is that it solves what is commonly known as the hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem of explaining how consciousness could arise from something like matter that is not conscious. I'll come back to this idea a little bit more soon. Second, Kastrup argues that analytic idealism can explain various facts about consciousness and the physical world in a natural and simple way, so that it's the best explanation for many of our scientific discoveries. With analytic idealism justified, Kastrup then tells a creation story about us and the physical world.
Once upon a time, everything that there was in the whole of existence was one universal mind, which I'm representing here as a circle. And of course, by definition, there was no outside world, because this mind is all that exists. There is nothing outside it. This one mind then underwent dissociation. Now, what is dissociation? Extreme forms of dissociation used to be called multiple personality disorder. And that's when different segments of what is fundamentally one and the same mind seemingly break apart, such that one segment has some of the memories, another alter has other memories, and they don't access each other's memories. Dissociation entails a dissociative boundary, the limit of the dissociated ideas and emotions. So from within the boundary, ideas and emotions from the outside cannot go in, and the other way around is also not possible. The ideas and emotions, the transpersonal mental states, these ideas and emotions impinge on the dissociative boundary, and then nature has developed a way to leverage this impingement. Evolution has found a way to zero in on that subtle impingement and amplify it and display it to us at a glance on the screen of perception. And the result of that is we see the world. We see the clouds, we see the sky, we see a fence, and we see plants and the rest of the world. This is the instrument panel. It's what appears on the instrument panel, on the dashboard of dials.
So human minds, according to Kastrup, are dissociated alters of universal consciousness. Reality has what we used to call multiple personality disorder, and we are one of reality's personalities. Our minds, according to Kastrup, exist within a boundary which is itself within universal consciousness, and the physical world is what universal consciousness looks like from our perspective. I think Kastrup presents quite an interesting idea here, but it's only one part of what we need to know to understand analytic idealism. The next part is that there are two different kinds of consciousness.
What we call phenomenal consciousness in analytic philosophy, it has a formal definition, can be defined as such: a state in which there is something, anything, it is like to be. Now, there is another term that is technically called metaconsciousness. It is the explicit awareness of a phenomenally conscious state. We are self-aware. We have what psychology calls metacognition. In other words, not only do we experience, we know that we experience. We explicitly recognize ourselves as a subjective entity that has experiences. And that's why we say, I have hunger, or I feel sad, as opposed to I am hunger and I am sadness. I think we can say with some confidence that the universal consciousness outside highly evolved life forms is not metacognitive.
I just wanted to make sure that you picked what he's saying up. According to Kastrup, there are two kinds of consciousness: phenomenal consciousness and metaconsciousness. And he says that we, as humans, are capable of both kinds of consciousness. We are both phenomenally conscious of the world around us, and we also have a higher form of consciousness, metaconsciousness. And metaconsciousness means that we are able to reflect on and gain knowledge of our phenomenal experiences. On the other hand, Kastrup says that universal consciousness is only phenomenally conscious. In much the same way we might think that a mouse or an amoeba may be conscious of the world around it without being able to reflect on their own experiences. My complaint with Kastrup's view is that he says universal consciousness is only phenomenally conscious. But if you do that, you straight away lose many of the advantages you gain by being an idealist. Remember that one of the reasons to take idealism seriously is that it solves the hard problem of consciousness. Idealism says that consciousness just is the basic stuff of the universe. So then you don't need to explain how consciousness could arise from something else like matter. But if Kastrup now starts with a lower form of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, he then needs to explain how it is that metaconsciousness, a higher form of consciousness, arises in the first place. Now, I don't think this is quite as difficult as the problem of explaining how consciousness arises from something unconscious like matter, but why make life difficult for yourself anyway? If you start with meta-consciousness, then everything else can follow quite easily. But it's not obvious how meta-consciousness could arise from something like phenomenal consciousness. Now, Kastrup does explain his reasons for starting with phenomenal consciousness, but once again, it's related to evolution.
We are self-aware. We have what psychology calls metacognition. And this metacognition as a mental function has evolved at very great cost over 4 billion years of evolution on a planetary ecosystem. The universal consciousness did not have to undergo evolution within a planetary ecosystem. It never has had to react to environmental challenges and eke out a living. It is unlikely that it is metacognitive itself, because metacognition very much seems to be the end result of 4 billion years of evolution. So we have it. I think we can say with some confidence that the universal consciousness outside highly evolved life forms is not metacognitive.
So Kastrup says that human minds have become metaconscious through a process of evolution, as we've struggled to survive on our planet. And since primitive forms of life are only phenomenally conscious, he thinks it stands to reason that universal consciousness, being the foundational form of consciousness, must itself also only be phenomenally conscious. Now, given what I've already said about evolutionary theory, you can probably already see why I'm not convinced by this argument. Evolutionary theory is only meant to be a theory of the dashboard, and time is only meant to be a theory of the dashboard as well. So I'm not too sure why we should think universal consciousness would be more like earlier forms of life. Similarly, our human minds are meant to be part of the realm beyond the dashboard as well. So since that is a timeless place, it seems hard to understand how our human minds could undergo evolution. But there is an even bigger problem for why an appeal to evolution simply won't work within analytic idealism. And it's a problem that's so big, in fact, that I'm genuinely amazed Kastrup doesn't notice it. Think about it. For evolution to work, there needs to be a mechanism that allows for a series of small changes to build up over many, many generations into big changes. The way it works in biology is through the process of procreation, where slight changes in the generations are maintained within the genetic code, which is then passed on from parent to child. The problem for Kastrup is that the mechanism for evolution just can't apply to minds. According to analytic idealism, the parent of every mind is universal consciousness that gives birth to them through the process of dissociation. My mind, your mind, the minds of Homo erectus, and the minds of every other stage within our supposed evolutionary journey have emerged not from their biological parents, but from universal consciousness itself. So there are no generations of mind that could allow for small changes to build up into big ones. So within analytic idealism, we are all first generations of mind that share the same mental parent. And that's a big problem for any attempt to use evolutionary theory applied to minds within analytic idealism. What Kastrup could say is that universal mind itself evolves alongside the evolution of human minds. Perhaps every time we die, our minds are released back into universal consciousness, and any change that we undergo goes back to universal consciousness as well. This would allow those small changes to build up and be preserved within universal consciousness. And this is actually something that Kastrup seems to think anyway.
The contents of your dissociative process, all the insights, all the maturity you've acquired, all of those gains are not lost. They are released in a broader cognitive context. They are made available to the mind of nature, to mind at large.
Basically, the idea here, if he went with it, would be that any small change to human minds would be released back into universal consciousness, making universal consciousness itself like some big cosmic mental genetic code. Kastrup could even go further and repeat the idea of genetic mutation. saying that each time universal consciousness dissociates, sometimes there are errors that produce a very slightly different kind of mind. Now, I am not advocating for this evolving mind view applied to universal consciousness, but it's the kind of view you would need if you were going to explain how metaconsciousness could arise from phenomenal consciousness within the analytic idealism framework. But even if you did adopt this view, there would still be a lot of problems you would need to sort out. Like, how does time apply to universal consciousness and human minds behind the dashboard? What mechanism could there be to preserve only the good changes to mind to push us along the process of evolution? And even if you sorted those problems out, universal consciousness would still be, now at least, metaconscious. But I don't think even Kastrup should take this evolving mind route anyway. As he admits, there's no reason to think that universal consciousness evolves. The theory of evolution says that we evolve due to the need to survive. But universal consciousness has no such need, so there would be no reason to think that universal consciousness would evolve. So since Kastrup's appeal to evolution is so weak, is there another reason why he says that universal consciousness is only phenomenally conscious? Well, I think there is, and at one point he lets it slip.
If you apply the word God to it, then you have a God that is a natural God, a God that acts spontaneously. It does what it does because it is what it is, not because it has a plan, not because it has thought things through, not because it has a premeditated idea about where it wants to go. And to me, at least, this is comforting, because a metacognitive God that allows for this bloodbath that survival in a planetary ecosystem is, would be a sadistic God, wouldn't it?
My suspicion is that this is the real reason why Kastrup wants to avoid saying that universal consciousness is metaconscious. He thinks it would make it too much like the god of monotheism and might tie up his view with theological concerns over the problem of evil, and might tie it with other kinds of religious conceptions that he would rather avoid. But this, again, seems like an irrational reason not to say that universal consciousness is metaconscious. The problem of evil arises in monotheism because we are not God, and so our suffering is obviously not his suffering. But under analytic idealism, our suffering is the suffering of a dissociated alter of universal consciousness. So that means that our suffering is also the suffering of universal consciousness itself, even if in dissociated form. So it would be very odd to accuse universal consciousness of being sadistic or evil, just because its mental activity causes suffering to itself in the form of a dissociated alter. Think of the analogy with a human. If a person with dissociative disorder suffers while one of its alters is in control, that doesn't make the host integrated mind sadistic. That mind didn't cause the suffering of the alter, it suffers with it. And in some sense, it suffers as it and because of it. Now, perhaps this further idea of universal consciousness suffering with its alters, and in some sense because of its alters, has certain shades of Christianity. But if so, the perception is very much altered within the analytic idealism framework, and it certainly seems to blunt the obvious criticisms levelled at Christianity related to the problems of evil. Now, this consideration brings me to another curiosity I had when looking at Kastrup's work. He presents analytic idealism as the explanatory model of reality. But once he does, he seems to stop thinking in terms of analytic idealism when he turns to look at criticisms and objections to his theory. In some ways, Kastrup seems to be like a scientist that presents an entire theory of the world, and then forgets that if it really is a theory of the world, then everything else must be explained in terms of it. And that would include him, his experiences, and even the theory itself. It would all have to fit within and be understood from within that theory. I think that if Kastrup really thought through the implications of analytic idealism, he'd realise that universal consciousness must at least be metaconscious, because I don't see any other way that our human minds could be metaconscious as dissociated alters of something that doesn't have that kind of consciousness. For one thing, the only cases of dissociation that we know of occur within a metaconscious mind, so there seems to be no reason to think that a process like dissociation could even occur within a mind that is purely phenomenally conscious. What's more, it seems highly implausible to think that a metaconscious mind could suddenly arise through a process of dissociation from a mind that is merely phenomenally conscious. It would be like a worm getting some mental disorder and suddenly starting to reflect on its own experience. In conclusion, my humble advice to Bernardo Kastrup would be to take analytic idealism seriously and follow through its implications. One of those, in my view, is that universal consciousness must be at least metaconscious and quite possibly a higher order of consciousness still. And if that makes Kastrup feel uneasy for less theoretical reasons, I would say he should just be brave and go where the evidence leads. But that's just my opinion. What I can say is that his explanations for how metaconsciousness in human minds can arise from a starting point that is only phenomenally conscious needs a much better argument and explanation than the one he gives. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that enlightening. If you're interested in philosophy and idealism, then definitely subscribe and check back in. I'm going to be talking more about these topics over the coming weeks and months. And if you become a member, there's a whole load of exclusive videos that you have access to, and it helps me keep this channel going and try and grow the work that I'm doing here. In the meantime, here's a really great video that you might enjoy from the channel that's definitely worth a watch. And as always, until the next time, have a wise day.